She counted the bills one more time. $17. That was everything. Everything after the burial, after the debts, after the neighbors took what they said was owed. Vivian Mercer stood at the edge of a dirt road with a canvas bag over her shoulder and boots held together by prayer, and she made a decision right there that would change two lives forever. If you've ever been told you were too much and not enough all at once, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Vivian Mercer had not cried at her husband's funeral. She had stood at the graveside in her black dress, the one that strained across her shoulders and pulled at the seams, because grief had not made her smaller, not even at the end, and she had watched the dirt fall, and she had not made a sound. The women from the church had whispered behind their gloves. She heard them. She had always heard them. Big Vivian, they called her when they thought she couldn't. Big Vivian, who married poor Thomas Mercer, and look how that turned out. Thomas had been a good man, a gentleman, a man who called her beautiful in the dark and meant it, who never once flinched when she walked into a room. But goodness does not pay debts, and gentleness does not keep a roof from leaking. And when the fever took him in November, it took everything else along with it: the house, the livestock, the little bit of savings they had buried in a tin beneath the floorboards. The creditors had found the tin. Vivian suspected the neighbor's boy had told them where to look. So she walked 8 miles from the town of Callow Creek to the posted notice she had read 3 days before, tacked to the wall outside the feed store between a reward poster and an advertisement for medicinal tonic. She had read it twice, memorized it, torn it down before anyone else could take it. Cook and housekeeper wanted. Ranch work. Hard conditions. Inquire at the Hayes property. 3 miles past the North Fork. She had 5 miles left to go when the sky turned the color of a bruise and the wind came down hard from the mountains. Her bag cut into her shoulder. Her feet inside those boots had stopped feeling like her feet an hour back. She did not slow down. The Hayes property appeared through the gray afternoon, like something that had been left behind by a world that had moved on without it. The fences along the road were standing but barely posts, leaning at angles that suggested exhaustion, more than damage wire sagging between them, like it had simply lost the will. The barn roof had a dark stain along one side that she recognized as rot. The house itself was tall and broad, and built from good timber, the kind that lasts, but the porch boards were warped and the windows needed washing, and the whole place carried the particular silence of a man living alone who had stopped noticing what silence costs. She walked up to the front door and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time with the flat of her fist. The door opened and Coulter Hayes filled the frame the way a storm fills a valley, completely suddenly, with no warning and no apology. He was 6'4" if he was an inch broad through the shoulders, dark-haired and dark-eyed, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the Wyoming mountains behind him. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he was holding a coffee mug, and he was staring at her like she was something the wind had blown onto his porch that he couldn't quite identify. "Help you," he said. His voice was low and flat and carried no warmth in it but no cruelty either. Just the voice of a man who had forgotten how to talk to people because there hadn't been any people to talk to. Vivian straightened her back. She was aware of how she looked wind-burned and road-dusty, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, her coat damp at the shoulders. She was aware of the way his eyes moved across her, the brief assessment, and she was aware of what he saw. A big woman, heavy through the hips and full through the chest. Broad in the way her mother had called sturdy, and the church women had called something else entirely. "I'm here about the position," she said. "The cook and housekeeper." He looked at her for a long moment. "That notice been up 3 weeks," he said. "I know. I saw it 3 days ago, and it took me this long to settle my affairs and get here. You walk from Callow Creek." Something moved behind his eyes. Not sympathy exactly, more like recalculation. "That's 8 miles, he said. 7 3/4, she said. I counted. He looked at the bag over her shoulder. He looked at her boots. He looked at her face, and she held still under that look the way she had learned to hold still under all kinds of looks, and she did not flinch, and she did not look away. "You got any experience?" he said. "I kept a house for 11 years, she said. "I can cook for a crew of 20, or a man alone, whichever you need. I can preserve, I can bake, I can manage a kitchen on short rations and make it taste like there's plenty. I know medicine enough to treat most injuries that don't need a doctor. I know how to keep accounts, and I know how to stretch a dollar until it screams. I don't need an accountant." "No," she said. "But you need someone who won't quit when it gets hard, and I don't quit." He was quiet for another long moment. Wind moved across the porch between them and rattled something loose somewhere in the barn. "The work is hard," he said finally. "The house is cold. I don't have much to offer beyond room and board and a wage that ain't generous." "What's the wage?" he told her. She calculated. It was low. It was lower than she'd hoped. It was higher than nothing, and nothing was what she had. "That'll do," she said. He stepped back from the door. It wasn't an invitation exactly. It was more like a removal of an obstacle. But she walked through it, and that was enough. His name was Colter Hayes, and he had been living alone on the ranch for 9 years since his wife Clara had died of a difficult childbirth and taken the baby with her. He did not tell Vivian this in the first hour or the first day. She learned it in pieces, the way you learn most things about a man who has built silence into the walls of himself, a photograph on the mantel, a small carved cradle in an upstairs room she found when she was cleaning. The way he never once sat at the head of the table, but always at the side, as if the head still belonged to someone else. The house was not dirty, so much as it was neglected. There is a difference. Dirty means a man has stopped caring. Neglected means he has been so consumed by survival that the smaller things have had to wait. The floors needed scrubbing, but the structure was sound. The kitchen had a good iron stove, but the flue needed cleaning, and there was a bird's nest lodged in the upper pipe that explained why every fire smoked. The pantry was sparse, but organized. He knew where things were, he just didn't have enough of them. She worked through that first evening without being asked to and without being directed. She found the problem with the flue, and she fixed it because the nest was accessible from outside with a long stick and 20 minutes of determination. She made a fire that didn't smoke, and she cooked supper from what was in the pantry: salt pork, and dried beans, and cornbread from a sack of meal she found behind the flour, and she set it on the table, and she called him in from the barn. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table, and something happened in his face that she didn't have a name for yet. "You fixed the flue," he said. "Bird's nest in the upper pipe," she said. "Cleared it out. Fire draws clean now." He sat down. He ate. He didn't say much, but he ate everything on his plate, and he poured himself a second cup of coffee from the pot she'd kept warm on the back of the stove. And when he was done, he looked up at her and said, "That's the best meal I've had in 3 years." "That's a low bar," she said, "but I'll take it." He almost smiled. She noticed. The days found their rhythm the way water finds its level gradually without drama, until suddenly it was simply the shape of things. Vivian rose before dawn and had the fire going, and coffee ready by the time Colter came in from checking the cattle. She cooked breakfast and packed provisions for the day, and spent the daylight hours attacking the house with the systematic thoroughness of a woman who understood that a home is not a luxury, but a foundation. She scrubbed floors and washed windows and patched curtains and organized the pantry and took inventory of what was needed and began a list. She also listened. Colter was not a talkative man, but he was not a silent one either. He talked when he had something to say. He said things with precision. He did not waste words on pleasantries, but he did not withhold information. And over the course of those first weeks, Vivian learned the shape of his trouble, the way she had learned the shape of the house methodically, piece by piece. The ranch was 300 acres, good land, well watered, with a creek running through the south pasture that never dried up even in summer. The cattle were quality stock, not as many as there should have been, but enough to run a solid operation if the operation had support. The problem was not the land, and it was not the cattle. The problem was Victor Langford. She heard the name first from Colter, spoken with a flatness that she had already learned meant the opposite of calm. Langford's man was by the south fence again. he said one morning, setting his coffee cup down with a careful deliberateness that told her how hard he was working to keep his voice level. Third time this month. What does he want? Same thing Langford always wants, the land. She had heard of Victor Langford in town. Everyone in the territory had heard of Victor Langford. He owned the bank in Callow Creek, and 3 others besides, and he owned the largest ranch in the valley, and he owned. It was generally understood the judge and 2 of the 3 town councilmen, and the sheriff's goodwill, if not his conscience. He was a man who had decided that the law was a tool like a hammer or a surveying stake, and that a man with enough money could pick it up and use it however he liked. "He been after this land long?" she asked. 10 years, Coulter said. "Since before Clara died. He offered to buy it then. I said no. He raised the offer. I said no. Then Clara went, and he thought I'd be easier to move." A pause. "He was wrong about that. Why does he want it so badly?" Coulter looked at her across the table. "Water rights," he said. "The creek that runs through my south pasture is the same creek that feeds 3 other properties and eventually runs into the Langford East fields. If he owns the source, he owns leverage over every rancher in this valley. That's how he thinks. Not about cattle or crops. About leverage." She understood then. This was not a simple land dispute. This was a man who collected power the way other men collected debts, and Coulter Hayes and his 300 acres were the last piece he didn't have. What Vivian did not understand yet, what she was only beginning to understand, was how far Langford was willing to go. She found out on a Tuesday 6 weeks after she arrived. She had walked into town for supplies because Coulter had taught her the route and trusted her with the ranch account, and because the pantry needed restocking, and she had a list. She had the wagon and the 2 bay horses, and she drove them competently and without fuss because she had driven wagons before, and she was not a woman who was made smaller by tasks that some people considered man's work. The general store in Callow Creek was run by a man named Horace Finch, who had the body of a man who sampled his own inventory and the eyes of a man who noted everything and shared it with whoever he thought might pay for the information. He watched Vivian come through the door with an expression that she had learned to translate, not surprise exactly, but the recalculation of a man adjusting his gossip. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "working for Coulter Hayes now, are you?" "I am," she said. She put her list on the counter. He looked at it. He looked at her. "You know," he said in the tone of a man about to say something that pretended to be concern and was actually warning, "most women don't last out there. It's a hard place. Coulter Hayes is a hard man." "I'm a hard woman," she said. "Fill the order, please." He filled it, but he talked while he filled it the way men like him always talked, sideways, and insinuating mentioning names she was supposed to react to testing her for information or vulnerability, or both. She gave him nothing. It was when she was loading the wagon in front of the store that the women appeared. There were 3 of them, wives of prosperous men, dressed in the particular armor of women who have decided that respectability is a weapon. The one in front was Margaret Finch, the storekeeper's wife, she would later learn, with a face like a church door, hard dark, and designed to keep people out. "You're the widow who's taken up with Coulter Hayes," Margaret Finch said. "Not a question." "I'm the housekeeper and cook at the Hayes Ranch," Vivian said. She lifted a sack of flour into the wagon bed without straining. "Is that what they're calling it?" Vivian turned and looked at her. There are moments in the woman's life when she has to make a decision about what kind of woman she is going to be. Not the general decision that gets made gradually over years, but the specific moment-to-moment decision whether to shrink or whether to stand. Vivian had been making that decision her whole life. She had been making it every time someone looked at her body and drew conclusions. Every time someone called her too much. Every time Thomas had been in the ground less than 2 months and already people were deciding what her grief meant and what her choices meant and who she was allowed to be. She was very tired of shrinking. "Say what you mean, ma'am," she said. Her voice was even. Her eyes were steady. "Or leave me to my work." Margaret Finch's chin went up. I mean that a woman in your position ought to have some care for her reputation. Going out to that ranch living under that man's roof. I am a working woman with legal employment, Vivian said. My position is cook and housekeeper. My reputation is my own business. And if you have something to say to me that isn't an implication or an insult, I'm listening. Otherwise. She turned back to the wagon and lifted another sack. She heard them leave. She finished loading the wagon. Her hands were steady the whole time. What she didn't know, loading that wagon, was that Margaret Finch's husband was in business with Victor Langford, and that the conversation she had just refused to have would be reported back to Langford's office by sundown, and that Langford would file that information away with the particular patience of a man who plans not seasons ahead, but years. She didn't know that yet. What she knew was the road back to the ranch, and the way the late afternoon light fell golden across the grass, and the particular satisfaction of a wagon loaded, and a list fulfilled, and a job to drive back to. She knew that when she pulled up to the barn and Coulter came out to help with the horses, he looked at the wagon bed and then looked at her with something in his face that she was beginning to recognize. "You got everything," he said. "Everything on the list," she said. "And I found dried apples at the bottom of Finch's stock that he'd forgotten he had. Talked him down on the price." He looked at her, that almost smile again. "How?" "I asked him if he wanted to tell his wife he'd overcharged a widow," she said, "or if he wanted to give me a fair price and not have that conversation." Coulter Hayes laughed. It was a short sound, rusty from disuse like a gate that hadn't been opened in years. But it was real, and it was warm, and it changed his whole face, made him look younger, made him look like someone who had once known how to be easy in the world and might remember how again. Vivian turned away to unhitch the horses before he could see what it did to her face. That night after supper, he stayed at the table longer than usual. The lamp was burning low, and the fire in the stove had settled to coals, and outside the wind was doing what Wyoming wind does in October, which is remind you how small you are. "The women in town," he said. "They give you trouble." She looked up from her mending. "Nothing I couldn't handle." "They'll talk. They already talk," she said. "People have been talking about me since I was 14 years old, and my body decided to announce itself to the world whether I wanted it to or not. I stopped waiting for them to stop." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara had the same trouble," he said. "People talked about her too. She was from down south, didn't know anyone came here with me when I brought this land. They never really let her in." "I'm sorry," Vivian said. "She didn't care after a while," he said. "She said the land was enough, the ranch, the work. She said a woman who's busy building something real doesn't have time to mourn what small people think." Vivian set her mending down. "She sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was." He looked at his coffee cup. "She would have liked you, I think." The fire ticked in the stove. The wind pressed against the windows. Vivian picked her mending back up. "Mr. Hayes," she said. "Coulter," he said. "Coulter." She said it carefully, like testing the weight of it. "Tell me about Langford. All of it. Because I've been listening and I've been watching, and I think you've been fighting this alone for too long, and a problem that's been going on for 10 years isn't going to solve itself, and I'd like to know the full shape of what we're dealing with." He looked at her for a long moment across the lamplit table. Then he started talking. And that was the night everything changed. Coulter talked for 2 hours. He talked the way a man talks when he has been holding something too long, and the weight of it has finally found a crack to pour through. He told her about the first letter from Langford's lawyer arriving 3 months after Clara died, polite and formal, and wrapped in sympathy that was nothing but paper over wire. He told her about the second offer hire with a clause about fair market consideration that any honest man would have laughed at. He told her about the fence posts that started disappearing along the south boundary 1 or 2 at a time. Nothing you could prove, nothing you could take to the sheriff. He told her about the loan at the Callow Creek Bank, Langford's bank, that he had taken out 5 years ago to survive a bad winter, and how the interest had been quietly adjusted twice without his signature, and how when he had gone to the bank to dispute it, the manager had looked at him across the desk with the particular blankness of a man who has been told what to see and what not to see. Vivian listened to all of it without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "Do you still have the original loan documents?" He looked at her. "What?" "The papers you signed. The original terms. Do you still have them?" Yes. In the strongbox upstairs." "Good," she said. "Don't let anyone near that strongbox, and tomorrow I want to look at them." He stared at her for a moment, like she was a map of territory he hadn't known existed. "Most people I tell that to," he said slowly, "tell me I ought to just take the money and be done with it." "Most people haven't lost everything twice," she said. "The first time you lose it, you grieve. The second time, you get organized." He was quiet for a beat. Then, "You lost everything twice. Thomas was my second husband," she said. She picked up her mending again. "The first one left. Took the house, took the account, left me the debt and a note that said I was too much work. I was 26 years old and I had $11 and a dress that didn't fit right." She kept her eyes on the needle. "So yes, I know what it looks like when someone is trying to take what's yours by making you feel like it isn't worth fighting for. And I know what it costs when you believe them." Coulter Hayes said nothing. But something settled in his face, some long-held tightness that told her the words had landed somewhere. They mattered. She went to bed that night with the list of loan irregularities turning over in her head like stones in a current, and she slept 4 hours and woke before dawn and lay there in the dark, listening to the ranch breathe around her. She had lived in enough houses to know that houses have personalities. This one had the personality of a man bracing for a blow. Tense, watchful, holding itself careful. She wanted to change that. She didn't know yet how much that wanting was going to cost her. The first direct threat came 11 days later. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horses, 3 of them coming up the road at a pace that wasn't a visit, but wasn't quite a charge either, the particular speed of men who want to be noticed before they arrive. She dried her hands on her apron and walked to the front of the house and opened the door before they had a chance to knock, because she had learned a long time ago that letting people knock gave them a power she wasn't willing to concede. There were 3 men. The one in front was lean and pale, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had curdled into something meaner. He had a badge on his coat, deputy, not sheriff, and he carried himself like the badge was the only thing keeping him together. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat in the gesture that was courtesy's shape with none of its substance. "Deputy Rawls, looking for Coulter Hayes." "He's out on the south pasture," she said. "Can I help you?" "Bank business," he said. "Need to speak to Hayes directly." "Then you can wait," she said. "Or you can ride out to the south pasture and find him yourself. Your choice." Rawls looked at her with the flat assessment of a man deciding how seriously to take an obstacle. His eyes moved over her in a way that was meant to diminish, and she let it go past her like weather. "You're the new housekeeper," he said. "I am. Word in town is, you've been making yourself comfortable out here." "Word in town," she said pleasantly, "is generally about 6 parts wrong. Was there something specific you needed, deputy, or did you ride out here to audit my comfort level?" One of the men behind him made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Rawls's jaw tightened. "Tell Hayes the bank expects him in town by end of week," he said. "There's a matter of the loan terms that needs his attention." "I'll tell him," she said. She watched them ride out, and then she went to find Coulter. He was where she'd said he was mending fence on the south line, and when she told him about Rawls, he went still in the particular way. He went still when something cold moved through him. "End of week," he said. That's what he said. "They're moving faster." He set down the fence tool. "Last time they sent a letter, now they're sending Rawls. What do they want?" "Payment on the adjusted interest, the amount they claim I owe that I never agreed to owe." He looked out at the pasture. "If I can't produce it by their deadline, they have grounds to call the full loan, which I also can't pay in full." "How much time do we have?" From what Rawls said, 10 days, maybe 12. She absorbed that. 10 days. She thought about the original documents in the strongbox upstairs, and about the adjusted interest he hadn't signed for, and about something her father had told her once, when she was a girl, when a man had tried to take his wagon by claiming a debt that didn't exist. The only thing a dishonest man fears more than exposure is a woman who knows how to read a contract. "Coulter," she said, "tonight after supper. You and me and those original documents. I want to go through every line." He looked at her. The afternoon was going gold around them, and the cattle moved in the pasture, and somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek, a bird was making an argument about something. "Vivian," he said carefully, "this isn't your fight." She looked right back at him. "I live in that house," she said. "I sleep under that roof. I've put 6 weeks of my labor into that kitchen and those floors and that pantry, and I've got a wage that depends on this ranch being a going concern. You want to tell me again it's not my fight?" A beat of silence. "No," he said quietly. "I reckon I don't." That night, they sat at the kitchen table, with the strong box open between them, and the lamp turned up high, and she went through the loan documents the way she went through everything methodically, without panic reading each line twice. Coulter sat across from her and answered her questions, and watched her with the expression of a man witnessing something he hadn't expected. She found it in the third document, a clause buried in the middle of a paragraph about interest accrual that specified any rate adjustment required written consent from both parties within 30 days of notification. "Did you ever receive written notification of the rate changes?" she said. "No." "And you never signed anything consenting to them?" "No." She set the document down and looked at him. "Then they're not legal," she said. "The adjusted interest isn't legally owed. They'd have to prove you received notification, and they'd have to produce your signature on a consent form that doesn't exist." Coulter was very still. "You're sure?" "I'm sure of what this document says. Whether the judge in Callow Creek will read it the same way depends on whether the judge in Callow Creek is bought." She paused. "Is he?" A long silence. "He's been Langford's man for 4 years," Coulter said. "Then we don't go to the judge first," she said. "We find someone Langford hasn't bought. Is there a circuit judge U.S. Marshal's office?" "Marshal Arden runs the district out of Cheyenne. He's—" Coulter stopped. "He's honest. He's known as an honest man. But getting him here, getting his attention on something this small compared to everything else in his territory." "It's not small," she said. "Fraudulent loan manipulation, forged terms, a deputy riding out to intimidate, that's a pattern. That's a case. Marshal Arden needs to see these documents." She tapped the papers on the table. "And he needs to see them before end of week." Coulter looked at her for a long moment. The lamp threw warm light across his face, and she watched him make a decision. The kind of decision that doesn't look like much from the outside, but changes everything on the inside. "I'll ride to Cheyenne," he said. "We'll write the letter tonight," she said. "And you'll take copies of every document in that box." They worked until midnight. Side by side at the table, she drafting and he reviewing the language, careful and precise, and backed by every piece of paper in the strongbox. When it was done, he read the letter through once more and looked at her with something in his eyes that she didn't have a word for yet. "Where did you learn to do this?" he said. "My father was a land lawyer before he got sick," she said. "He taught me that paper is the only weapon that outlasts a gunfight." 2 days later, with Coulter 3 hours out on the road to Cheyenne, the stable caught fire. Vivian smelled it before she saw it, the specific sharp bite of burning wood and hay and animal panic. A smell that bypasses the thinking part of the brain and goes straight to the part that moves. She was out the back door before she had made a conscious decision to move across the yard at a run that her body found without asking her permission, because there were horses in that stable, and she could hear them. The fire had started in the hay storage at the far end, which told her it wasn't an accident, because the hay was dry and stored proper, and you don't get a fire like that in the middle of a clear day from nothing. The near stall doors were still latched. She hit the first latch with her palm and swung it wide and slapped the mare inside on the flank and shouted, and the horse needed no more invitation. Out she went. The second stall, the big roan gelding, more smoke now, the heat pressing against her face. Latch. Swing, slap, go. She got all 4 horses out. She stood in the yard coughing, her eyes streaming from the smoke, watching the far end of the stable burn with a focused, ugly brightness, and she was shaking. Not from fear, she realized distantly, but from the particular vibration of fury held inside a body that hasn't yet decided what to do with it. Rawls appeared at the yard gate 20 minutes later, casual as a Sunday caller, with 2 men she didn't recognize. "Heard you had some trouble," he said. She looked at him. Her face was smoke-stained. Her hair had come completely down. She was holding a horse blanket she'd used to beat back a spark from the fence post, and she was still shaking with that cold, focused fury. "Funny thing," she said. "How fast word travels." "These things happen," he said. He didn't even have the courtesy to make it sound sincere. "Dry season, hay can go up fast." "The hay was stored proper," she said, "and the fire started at the far end away from the house against the foundation wall, where there's no lamp, no heat source, no reason for a fire to start." She paused. "Unless someone started it." Rawls's expression didn't change. That was almost the worst part, the absolute absence of anything like discomfort. "That's a serious accusation, ma'am." "I haven't made an accusation," she said. "I've made an observation. There's a difference. Though I imagine you know that." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt, but calculation. Then he touched his hat brim. "You ought to think about whether a woman alone out here without Hayes around is situated safely," he said. "Dangerous country. Accidents happen." "That sounds like a concern," she said. "Or it sounds like a threat." "Which is it, deputy?" He smiled. It didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Just a neighborly observation," he said. They rode out. She stood in the yard until they were gone from sight, and then she sat down on the fence rail because her legs decided they were done holding her upright for the moment, and she put her face in her hands, and she breathed slow and deliberate in through the nose and out through the mouth, the way you breathe when what you want to do is something you can't afford to do yet. When she lifted her head, the rancher from the neighboring property, a gray-haired man named Josiah Pruitt, who had apparently seen the smoke from his upper field and ridden over, was standing 10 feet away watching her with an expression that mixed respect with something that might have been recognition. "That was Deputy Rawls," he said. "Yes," she said. "He come out here for the fire or with the fire?" She looked at him. He was watching her steadily with the eyes of a man who had been in this valley long enough to know exactly what Langford's Reach looked like. "That's a perceptive question," she said. Pruitt dismounted. He tied his horse to the fence, and he looked at the smoldering remains of the stable's far end, and then he looked at the 4 horses standing safe in the yard, and then he looked at her. "My wife and I have been watching Langford squeeze people out of this valley for 6 years, he said quietly. "We've been watching and waiting and telling ourselves it wasn't our fight." He paused. "I think maybe we've been wrong about that." "I think maybe you have been too," she said. Not cruel, just honest. Pruitt was quiet for a long moment. "Hayes rode to Cheyenne." "Yes." "Good." He picked up the fence post that had scorched at the base and tested its weight. "I'll stay and help with the cleanup. And when Hayes gets back, tell him Josiah Pruitt is ready to have a conversation he should have had 4 years ago." Vivian looked at this gray-haired man, this neighbor who had waited too long, but was here now, and she felt something shift in the landscape of the fight, a change in weight distribution, like the first moment when a wagon that's been stuck begins to find purchase. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Pruitt said. "Langford hasn't played his last card, not by a long way." He was right about that. Coulter rode back from Cheyenne on the 5th day with 2 things: a written acknowledgement from Marshal Arden's office that the evidence had been received and was under review, and a face that told her the trip had cost him more than miles. "Arden's going to look into it," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway with trail dust still on him. "But he said it could take weeks, could take a month. He's got 3 counties under his jurisdiction, and 2 of them are on fire with other problems." "A month," she said. "Langford's deadline is in 4 days." She set the coffee pot down. She turned to face him. He looked exhausted, and something underneath the exhaustion that was very close to the edge of giving way, and she recognized that look because she had worn it herself more than once, and she knew that the worst thing you could do for a person wearing that look was pretend it wasn't there. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She poured the coffee, and she sat across from him, and she said, "Tell me the worst version. If the deadline passes and Langford moves to call the loan, what exactly happens?" "They come with the paperwork. Sheriff Briggs serves it. I have 30 days to pay the full loan amount or forfeit the property." "And you can't pay the full amount?" "No." "Can any of the neighboring ranchers stand as guarantors, Pruitt?" He looked up. "Pruitt. He was here when the stable burned," she said. "He stayed 4 hours and helped with the cleanup, and he told me to tell you he's ready for a conversation he should have had 4 years ago." Something moved through Coulter's face. It took her a moment to identify it because it was an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It was hope, and it was raw and careful and fragile the way hope always is in a man who has been without it long enough to forget it's possible. "Pruitt," he said again softly. "And if Pruitt may be others," she said. "Langford has been squeezing people in this valley for 6 years. That means 6 years of people watching and waiting and thinking it wasn't their fight. Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to be first." Coulter looked at her across the table. The lamp was burning between them, and the coffee was steaming, and outside the Wyoming night was pressing its cold face against the windows. "How are you doing this?" he said. "Doing what?" "This." He gestured a motion that encompassed the table, the documents, the conversation, all of it. "You've been here 6 weeks. This isn't your land. This isn't your fight by any obligation. And yet," he stopped. "Yet here I am," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When I was walking out here the first day 8 miles in boots that were giving out, I kept asking myself what I was doing, what I thought I was going to find at the end of that road." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I didn't have an answer then, but I think I've got one now." He waited. "I was looking for something worth fighting for," she said. "I've spent a lot of years fighting to survive. That's different. Surviving is just getting through. Fighting for something is different. It means something." She met his eyes. "This ranch means something. You mean something. And I don't walk away from things that mean something. I tried that once. It's a worse feeling than losing." Coulter Hayes looked at her for a long time without speaking. The fire in the stove ticked. Somewhere in the dark outside, one of the horses shifted in the yard where they'd been temporarily stabled since the fire. "Vivian," he said finally. His voice had changed, lower, quieter, stripped of the careful flatness he usually kept it at. "I need you to know something." "All right," she said. "I have been alone on this land for 9 years," he said. "And I have been fine. I've been managing. I've been surviving like you said. But since you walked up to that door 6 weeks ago..." He stopped. Tried again. "This house feels different. I feel different. And I don't entirely know what to do with that." The lamp burned between them. Vivian felt something tighten in her chest, not painfully more, like the feeling of something long compressed, finally being given room. "You don't have to do anything with it," she said gently. "Not right now. Right now we have a deadline in 4 days, and a marshal who might be a month out and a neighbor who wants to talk. That's enough to deal with right now." He nodded. Once. The careful nod of a man filing something away to return to. "Right," he said. "Pruitt first." "Pruitt first," she agreed. But she didn't sleep much that night, and it wasn't Langford's deadline keeping her awake. Pruitt came the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the mountains, which told Vivian everything she needed to know about the man's state of mind. You don't ride out at first light to a neighbor's ranch unless something has been sitting on your chest all night, keeping you from sleeping. Coulter met him at the gate, and they shook hands, the handshake of 2 men who have been cordial for years without ever being close, who are both now acknowledging that cordiality has run out of road. Vivian brought coffee to the porch and stayed. She did not excuse herself, and neither man asked her to, which told her something about how the night before had changed things. Langford's deadline is in 4 days, Coulter said. I know, Pruitt said. Rawls came by my place yesterday afternoon. Told me Hayes was in trouble on his loan and that smart neighbors might want to think about the valley's future ownership structure. He said it with the flat disgust of a man repeating something filthy. That's what he called it. Ownership structure. What did you tell him? I told him I'd think on it. Pruitt wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. What I was actually thinking was that I've been telling myself for 6 years that keeping my head down was protecting my family. And then I rode over here and saw what was left of your stable, and saw this woman standing in your yard with smoke on her face and 4 horses she'd pulled out herself, and I thought 6 years of keeping my head down and Langford still burning barns. He looked at Coulter directly. I'm done keeping my head down. It's going to cost you, Coulter said. You understand that. I understand that doing nothing has been costing me things I can't get back, Pruitt said. 6 years of watching. 6 years of my wife looking at me across the supper table, wondering when I was going to act like the man she married. His jaw tightened. What do you need? Coulter looked at Vivian. It was a brief look, barely a second, but it was a real one, the look of a man checking with a partner. Not a subordinate, not a housekeeper. A partner. We need neighbors, she said, not just you. We need to know who else in this valley has been squeezed, who else has irregularities in their loan documents, who else has had visits from Rawls that felt like warnings. Because Marshal Arden is reviewing our evidence, but one rancher's complaint is easy to dismiss. 4 ranchers, 6 ranchers, that's a pattern. That's something a federal marshal can act on quickly. Pruitt looked at her. Then he looked at Coulter. She always think this fast. Always, Coulter said. I can get you 3 names today, Pruitt said. The Calloways over on the East Ridge, they've been fighting a boundary dispute with Langford for 2 years that nobody can figure out how it started. The Hennessy brothers, Langford tried to buy them out last spring, and when they said no, their water access mysteriously got a legal challenge filed against it. And old Walt Greer, southeast of here, he took a loan from the bank 8 years back, and the terms have been adjusted twice. He paused. Same as yours. Same clause, Vivian asked. I don't know, but Walt's smart and he kept his papers. She set her coffee down. Then we need a meeting, she said. All of you here tonight if possible. Bring every document you have, every letter, every notice, every adjusted term. We build the full picture before the deadline hits. Pruitt nodded slowly. You think they'd come on this short notice? Tell them Langford's moving on the Hayes Ranch, she said. Tell them if the Hayes Ranch falls, the water rights on the South Creek change hands. Every person in this valley who depends on that creek downstream will feel it within a season. She met his eyes. That'll get them here. It got them there. By 7 that evening, the Hayes kitchen was full of people for the first time in what Coulter later said felt like a decade. The Calloways came husband and wife both, which Vivian noted because a woman at the table meant the decision had been talked through properly at home. The Hennessy brothers came 2 big red-headed men in their 30s who sat shoulder to shoulder and spoke in the shorthand of people who have been each other's only company for a long time. Walt Greer came alone 70 if he was a day with a leather satchel under his arm that he set on the table with the careful precision of a man who knows exactly what he's carrying. You're the widow Hayes hired, Walt Greer said to Vivian before she had said a word. Not unkindly, more like he was confirming something. I am, she said. Rawls told my boy you were trouble, he said. Rawls isn't wrong, she said. Walt Greer smiled for the first time. Good, he said. She laid out what they had, the original loan documents, the adjusted terms, the missing consent clause, the letter to Marshal Arden, and his acknowledgement. She explained it without condescension and without softening, because these were people who had been living with the consequences of Langford's manipulation for years, and they deserved the truth stated plainly. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Then, Walt Greer opened his leather satchel and put his documents on the table. Same clause, he said, and I've got something else. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, older, the crease marks deep and brown from years of folding and refolding. Letter from Langford himself. 7 years ago, before he got careful about putting things in writing. He offered to buy my land, and when I said no, he wrote back and said, and I'm quoting now, that I should consider carefully whether my family could afford the cost of being on the wrong side of progress in this valley. He paused. I kept it because my wife said a man who writes a letter like that is a man who's going to need to answer for it someday. The room absorbed that. That's a threat in writing, Vivian said. Yes, ma'am, Walt said. It is. She looked at Coulter. He was looking at Walt Greer with the expression of a man seeing a door he hadn't known was there. She understood exactly what he was feeling, because she was feeling it too, the shift from fighting alone to fighting together from a single set of footprints in the mud to something that looked like a front line. They worked through the documents for 2 hours. By the end of it, they had 4 cases of interest rate manipulation without proper consent, 2 cases of false boundary disputes, 1 illegal water access challenge, and a 7-year-old letter that amounted to written extortion from one of the most powerful men in the territory. This is enough for Arden, Vivian said. This is more than enough. We need to get this to him tomorrow, not wait for him to come to us, we go to him. That's a 3-day ride, Coulter said. One of the Hennessy brothers can ride fast, said the older Hennessy, whose name was Daniel. Thomas and I did the Cheyenne run in 2 days last spring when the creek was up. We were motivated. Consider yourself motivated, Vivian said. Thomas Hennessy grinned. It was the grin of a young man who has been waiting a long time for permission to do something. What do we tell him? Tell him Victor Langford has been running a coordinated scheme to seize land throughout Red Creek Valley through fraudulent loan manipulation, illegal water challenges, and written intimidation, and that 6 ranching families have documentary evidence and are prepared to testify. She looked around the table. Tell him the deadline is in 3 days and we need a federal presence in Callow Creek before Langford files his foreclosure papers. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Daniel Hennessy said quietly but with absolute conviction, "He'll come." Thomas was writing before 9 that night. The next 2 days were the longest Vivian could remember. Not because nothing happened. Things happened constantly. Too many things, but because the quality of the waiting had changed. It wasn't the passive waiting of a person with no options. It was the active, grinding, expensive waiting of people who have made their move and are watching the board to see how the other side responds. Langford responded on the morning of the 2nd day. He came himself. She had not expected that. She had expected Rawls or another deputy or a letter from a lawyer. She had not expected Victor Langford to ride up to the front gate of the Hayes Ranch in person alone, except for one man she didn't recognize at 10 in the morning on a Thursday. He was not what she had pictured. She had been picturing someone who looked like power, large, loud, armored in arrogance. Langford was medium height, slim with gray at his temples, and a coat that fit too well for Wyoming, and the careful grooming of a man who wants you to think of boardrooms rather than back alleys. He looked, she thought, like a banker, which he was exactly the point. He looked at her when she came to the door, and something registered in his eyes, not surprise exactly, but a brief recalibration. He had known she was here. He hadn't expected to find her interesting. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. His voice was smooth and practiced. "I was hoping to speak with Coulter Hayes." "He's here," she said. "So am I. Come in or don't." A slight pause. Then he came in. Coulter was at the kitchen table, and he stood when Langford entered, not from respect, but from the instinct of a man who doesn't want to be sitting down when the threat is standing up. The 2 men looked at each other, and the accumulated weight of 10 years of this, the letters, the visits, the fence posts, the adjusted interest, Clara dying and Langford circling like something that had smelled it from a distance, was present in the room as tangibly as the lamp and the table and the smell of coffee. "Coulter," Langford said. "Victor," Coulter said. "I came to talk before things get formal," Langford said. He sat down at the table without being invited with the ease of a man accustomed to owning every room he enters. "I want you to understand I take no pleasure in the legal proceedings. The bank has obligations. The terms of your loan." The terms of his loan. Vivian said, sitting down across from Langford, specifically require written consent for any rate adjustment. Consent Mr. Hayes never gave. We have the original documents that no notification was served and no consent was obtained. She folded her hands on the table. So when you say the terms of the loan, Mr. Langford, I'd like to know which terms you mean. The ones he signed or the ones someone added later? The room went very still. Langford looked at her. It was a long look, and it was not the look he had come in with, not the smooth, careful appraisal of a man managing an obstacle. This was something more focused and considerably less pleasant. "You've been busy," he said. "I have," she agreed. "Mrs. Mercer." He shifted his attention to her, fully leaving Coulter out of it, as if the man didn't exist, as if this were now a conversation between the two of them. "I understand you've had a difficult time. Widowed, starting over, taking work where you can find it. I respect that kind of resilience." The word respect in his mouth had no relationship to its dictionary definition. "But you should be careful about getting caught in the middle of something that has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," she said. "I live here. I work here. And I've spent the last 6 weeks watching a man who has been fighting alone for 9 years finally understand he doesn't have to fight alone anymore. Whatever you came here to offer or threaten Mr. Langford, you should know that the answer is no. It was no before you came, and it'll be no when you leave." Langford looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked at Coulter. "You let your housekeeper speak for you," he said. "She's not speaking for me," Coulter said. "She's saying what I'd say better than I'd say it." A beat. "And she's right. The answer is no." Something moved in Langford's face. Brief, controlled, gone almost before it was there. But she saw it. It wasn't anger. It was the particular expression of a man who has just understood that the situation is more complicated than his information suggested, and who is already calculating what to do about it. He stood, buttoned his coat. "The deadline stands," he said. "I have obligations to the bank's investors and I intend to meet them through proper legal channels." "You do that," Vivian said. "We'll meet you there." He left. Coulter waited until the sound of hooves had faded down the road. Then he let out a long, slow breath and sat down heavily in the chair Langford had occupied. "That man is going to come back hard," he said. "Yes," she said. "But he came here himself, which means he's worried. A man who isn't worried sends Rawls. A man who sends himself is trying to assess how much trouble he's actually in." She stood and moved to the stove. "He's in more trouble than he knows." She said it calmly because she believed it, but her hands were not entirely steady pouring the coffee, and she was glad her back was to him when it happened. What happened that night proved Coulter right about Langford coming back hard. She woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of cattle. Not the normal sounds a herd makes at night, but the specific panicked noise of animals that have been deliberately disturbed running sounds the crash of something broken. She was out of bed and had her boots on before she was fully awake, and she was at the window in time to see the shapes of riders moving along the far edge of the south pasture in the dark. 3 riders, moving the cattle. She didn't hesitate. She went to Coulter's door and knocked hard twice. Riders in the south pasture, moving the herd. She heard him hit the floor. They were both outside in under 2 minutes. The cattle were scattered across the pasture in the particular chaos of animals that have been run without purpose, not rustled cleanly, just scattered because the point wasn't to take the cattle. The point was damage. Scattered cattle in the dark meant hours of work to gather fences down possible injuries to animals and a rancher spending the next day on recovery instead of getting to town. Coulter had his rifle. She had the lantern and the sense of direction. "I know the south fence line," she said. "I've walked it twice this week." Vivian, "I know where they'll have cut it," she said. 3 riders moving animals in the dark. They needed an exit. South corner where the fence angles to the creek. That's where the shadow is deepest. She met his eyes in the lamplight. "I'll go to the corner. You circle from the east and push the herd back toward the gate." He looked at her, this woman standing in the dark in her boots and her coat steady as bedrock. "Don't go past the fence line," he said. "I know what I'm doing," she said. She found the cut fence exactly where she'd said she would. 3 posts, pulled wire laid flat, the grass on the other side disturbed by hooves going through. The riders were gone. They had made their point and left because the point was disruption, not confrontation. She stood at the cut fence in the dark and looked out at the direction they'd gone, and she felt the cold fury again, the same feeling she'd had standing in the yard watching the stable burn. Not helplessness. Fury. There is an enormous difference. It took them until 4 in the morning to gather the scattered cattle and do a count. They lost none, the herd was intact, just spread. 2 fence sections down, 1 steer with a minor leg injury from a fall in the dark. It could have been worse. Langford's men had been making a statement, not a serious tactical move. That told her something. "He's rattled," she said when they finally came back to the house. This was noise. A man who was confident would have waited for the legal deadline and let the bank do the work. A man who does this in the middle of the night is a man who's heard something that spooked him. Coulter looked up. Dust on his face, exhaustion in every line of him, but his eyes sharp. "Thomas Hennessy," he said. "Thomas made it to Cheyenne," she said, and said something that got back to Langford, or Langford has a contact in Arden's office. "Either way," she said, "he knows we went to the marshal, and he's trying to create enough damage and chaos in the next 48 hours that we're too busy surviving to fight back." "How do we stop that?" She sat down at the table. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, the specific gray-blue of a Wyoming dawn coming in cold and clear. "We don't react," she said. "We let him make noise. We keep our documents in order. We keep our neighbors informed, and we wait for Arden." She looked at him. "But we need to send word to Pruitt and the Callaways today. Tell them what happened tonight. If Langford is moving on us, he may move on them too. They need to be ready. I'll ride out at first light. And Coulter." She waited until he looked at her. "When you come back, there's something I need to tell you. Something about the letter I sent to Arden. Something I added that I didn't mention when we wrote it together." He went still. "What did you add?" "I included a statement about the stable fire," she said, "and about Rawls. His visits, the timing, the things he said." She held his gaze. "I named him directly as a participant in a pattern of intimidation. Which means when Arden comes, Rawls is going to know his name is on a federal document, and Rawls is going to tell Langford." Coulter was very quiet for a moment. "That puts a target on you," he said. "It puts a target on the truth," she said. "Which is where it belongs." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said very quietly, with a roughness in his voice that had nothing to do with the hours or the cold, "Vivian, I need you to promise me something." "Depends on the something," she said. "Promise me you won't take risks you don't tell me about first." She was quiet for a moment. "I can't promise that," she said honestly. "Because sometimes the moment doesn't allow for consultation, like last night at the South Fence." She paused. "But I promise I'll tell you after. Every time. I won't keep things from you." He nodded once, slowly, like a man accepting terms he isn't entirely satisfied with, but understands are the best he's going to get. "All right," he said. It was the morning of the last day before the deadline. 18 hours away, somewhere on the road from Cheyenne, Marshal Arden either was or wasn't riding. And in the bank in Callow Creek, Victor Langford either was or wasn't preparing his foreclosure papers. And in the kitchen of the Hayes Ranch, 2 people sat across from each other in the early morning light, exhausted and steady, and neither one of them said what was sitting plainly in the space between them. That somewhere between the documents and the dark rides, and the burning stable, and the scattered cattle, and every long conversation over a lamp burning low, something had been built that had nothing to do with the ranch and everything to do with the 2 people fighting for it. The deadline came at noon the next day, like a door swinging shut. And Marshal Arden rode through the gate at 11:53. Marshal Arden was not a large man, which surprised her. She had been building him in her imagination over the past week into something proportional to the weight he carried. Tall, imposing the kind of presence that fills a doorway. What rode through the gate at 11:53 was a man of medium height, somewhere past 50, with a weathered face and quiet eyes, and the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have learned not to waste anything, including gestures. He had 2 deputies with him. Thomas Hennessy rode behind them, trail dusty and visibly relieved to be back. Vivian was at the gate before Coulter reached it, because she had been watching the road for 2 hours, and her legs had simply started moving when she saw the riders. She stood back while Coulter and Arden shook hands, and she watched Arden's eyes move across the yard. The temporary horse shelter rigged since the stable fire. The repaired fence sections still showing new wood, the scorched foundation wall of the barn's far end, and she could see him reading it the way she had learned to read a kitchen quickly, the way someone reads a place that has been under pressure. Then Arden looked at her. "You're Mrs. Mercer," he said. Not a question. "I am," she said. "Your letter was the clearest piece of legal documentation I've received from a civilian in 11 years of this work," he said. "I'd like to talk to you first." Coulter glanced at her. She kept her face neutral, but something in her chest loosened a fraction, the way a knot loosens when you find the right end to pull. They sat at the kitchen table, Arden, Coulter, Vivian, and one of the deputies who took notes without being asked, and Arden went through everything. He was thorough, and he was fast, the efficiency of a man who has conducted hundreds of these conversations and knows exactly which questions cut to the center. He reviewed the loan documents. He reviewed the consent clause. He reviewed the letter Walt Greer had been carrying in his leather satchel for 7 years. When he set that letter down, he was quiet for a moment. "This is Langford's handwriting," he said. "Confirmed by 2 people who've received other correspondence from him," Vivian said. "We can produce them. I'll need them." He tapped the letter. "This changes the scope of what I'm looking at. The loan manipulation is fraud. The water access challenges are civil, but layered on top of the fraud, they demonstrate a pattern. But a written intimidation threat from a bank owner to a private citizen about the cost of being on the wrong side of his interests, that is a federal matter." He looked at Coulter. "How many people in this valley have received similar communications, written or verbal?" "Verbal at least 5 we know of," Coulter said. "Written just Greer." "Rawls," Vivian said. "Deputy Rawls has made statements during his visits here that constitute verbal intimidation. We have my account and Coulter's of at least 3 separate incidents. One of them included a direct comment about whether a woman alone was safely situated, made after the stable fire, while the fire was still smoldering." She paused. "If that's not an implicit threat connected to the arson, I don't know what is." Arden looked at her steadily. "You wrote in your letter that you believe Rawls is operating under Langford's direction." "I believe Rawls does nothing without Langford's direction," she said. "A deputy with genuine concern for public safety does not arrive at the scene of a fire 20 minutes after it starts looking that calm." Arden turned to his deputy. "Note that down verbatim," he said. The deadline passed at noon while Arden was still at the table. No one mentioned it directly. There was no need to. The presence of a U.S. Marshal at the Hayes kitchen table was its own answer to any foreclosure papers Langford might have been preparing across town. Langford found out by 1 o'clock. She knew this because Rawls appeared at the gate at 1:15, and the careful, smooth composure he usually wore was slightly off, a tightness around the mouth. A haste in the way he'd ridden that he hadn't fully controlled before arriving. He saw the federal horses at the post and stopped. Arden stepped onto the porch before Rawls had decided what to do about it. "Deputy Rawls," Arden said. His voice carried no particular warmth or hostility. It was the voice of a man stating a fact. "Marshal Arden Federal District, I'll need you to come in and give a statement." Rawls looked at Arden. He looked at the federal badge. He looked past Arden at the door where Vivian stood watching, and for just a moment his composure cracked a flash of something raw and ugly before he locked it down again. "I'm here on county business," he said. "You're here on whatever business I say you're here on," Arden said pleasantly. "Come inside, deputy." Rawls came inside. She did not stay for that conversation. Arden asked her and Coulter to wait on the porch. which she understood you don't contaminate a statement by having the complainants in the room. She sat on the porch step, and Coulter sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the tension in him. The coiled spring stillness of a man waiting for something he has been waiting for a very long time. "He's going to deny everything," Coulter said quietly. "Of course he is," she said. "But denial and innocence aren't the same thing. Arden knows that." 30 minutes later, Arden came out. He looked at them both. "Rawls is going to require further questioning," he said carefully. "In the meantime, I'm riding into Callow Creek. I'd like you both to come. And I'd like the Pruitt family, Walt Greer, and the Calloway family present, if they can be reached." "The Hennessy brothers went ahead to alert them," Vivian said. "They should be in town by now." Arden looked at her with an expression that was as close to approval as she suspected his face normally got. "Good," he said. The ride into Callow Creek was the strangest Vivian had experienced. She rode beside Coulter on the road she had walked 8 weeks ago with $17 and worn-out boots, and the landscape was identical: the same grass, the same sky, the same distant mountains, and she was entirely different inside it. Not unafraid. Something more useful than unafraid. Clear. She was clear in the way you get clear when you have run out of options that don't involve forward movement, and you have chosen to move forward so fully that the fear becomes irrelevant. Coulter rode close. Once, when her horse shied at something in the grass, his hand came out automatically and steadied her arm, and he left it there a beat longer than steadying required, and neither of them said anything about it. The town of Callow Creek had the particular tension of a place that knows something is happening before it knows what. People on the sidewalk watched them come in: Arden and his deputies, Coulter and Vivian, and behind them, Pruitt and his wife, and Walt Greer and the Calloways, a procession that was too organized to be casual and too quiet to be a celebration. Langford was at the bank. Of course he was. It was his fortress, his ground, the place where he kept his leverage. Arden walked in without knocking, and Vivian walked in behind him, and she heard the intake of breath from the teller and the clerk, and the silence that fell over the room like something physical. Langford was at his desk. He stood when they entered. He couldn't not stand with a federal marshal coming through his door, but his face had gone through several calculations in the 2 seconds it took Arden to cross the room. And what it settled on was a version of professional courtesy stretched thin over something considerably harder. "Marshal Arden," he said, "this is unexpected." "I imagine it is," Arden said. He placed a document on the desk. "Victor Langford, I'm serving you notice of a federal investigation into your banking practices, specifically related to fraudulent modification of loan terms without borrower consent across multiple accounts in this district. I have documentary evidence from 6 separate borrowers' correspondence, in your own hand, constituting written intimidation of a private citizen, and testimony indicating a pattern of coordinated harassment using county law enforcement resources." He paused. "I'll need your cooperation in providing the bank's loan records for the past 10 years. The room was absolutely silent. Langford looked at the document. He looked at Arden. His eyes moved once briefly, almost imperceptibly, to Vivian standing behind Arden's left shoulder. "This is highly irregular," he said. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the effort in it now, the first time she had heard effort in his voice. "I'll need to contact my attorney." "That's your right," Arden said. "In the meantime, the bank's records are under federal hold. Nothing leaves this building without my authorization. You can't simply walk in here and—" "I can," Arden said. Simple, factual, final. Langford looked at the document again. Something happened in his face. Not collapse, not yet, but the first visible crack in the structure. The moment when a man who has been operating on the assumption that he is untouchable begins to understand that the assumption was wrong. He sat down. Slowly. Like a man whose legs have made a decision his pride hasn't caught up with yet. Vivian stood in that bank and watched Victor Langford sit down, and she felt the moment land in her body the way important moments always do. Not triumphantly, not with the satisfaction she might have expected, but with something quieter and heavier. The particular weight of a thing that has been a long time coming, finally arriving. The investigation took 3 days to execute and 3 months to complete, but the shape of it was determined in those 3 days when Arden's deputies went through the bank's records with the systematic thoroughness of men who had been given clear direction and adequate authority. What they found in those records was worse than anything Vivian had outlined in her letter. 14 accounts. 14 separate borrowers across Red Creek Valley who had experienced unauthorized interest rate modifications. 12 of them had received no written notification. 7 had ultimately sold their properties not because they chose to, but because the manufactured debt had become unmanageable, and they had not known the modification was illegal, and they had not had anyone to sit down with them at a kitchen table at midnight and read the original documents line by line. She sat with that number for a long time. 7 families. "We can't undo those sales," she said to Coulter the night after Arden had laid out the scope of the investigation. "No," he said, "but we can make sure the next 14 families don't lose theirs." He looked at her. They were at the kitchen table again, where they always ended up, the lamp between them, the dark outside the ranch, quiet around them. "You're going to help them," he said. Not a question. If Arden needs witnesses and testimony from all 6 families, they're going to need someone to coordinate that. Someone to make sure every document is in order. Every statement is clear. Every person who needs to testify knows what to say and how to say it. She paused. "I've been doing this for 2 months. I know the material." "Vivian," he said, and the way he said her name, the particular weight he put on it, the care made her stop and look at him fully. "When this is done, when Langford is dealt with, and the loan is settled, and the valley is—" He stopped. Started again. "I want to ask you something, but I don't want to ask it while all of this is still in motion. Because I don't want you to hear the question wrong. I don't want you to think it's about gratitude or obligation or—" "Coulter," she said gently. "Yeah." "Ask me when it's done," she said. "I'll still be here." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face. The long-held tension, the 9 years of alone, the careful walls shifted in a way she had been watching happen gradually for weeks, like a season changing like ice going out on a river. "You'll still be here," he said. "I told you when I came," she said. "I don't quit." The full charges against Langford came down 6 weeks later. Fraud, wire manipulation of financial instruments, conspiracy to deprive citizens of property rights through deceptive means, and because of Rawls, who cooperated with Arden's investigation in exchange for reduced charges, and apparently had quite a lot to say about quite a number of things accessory to arson. The Hayes stable fire. Proved documented attached to Langford's name in a federal indictment. Rawls lost his badge the same day the indictment was filed. The sheriff, to his credit, and Vivian revised her opinion of him slightly. Based on this, had been watching Rawls for a year and had suspected the Langford connection but not had evidence. He had the evidence now. The bank passed into receivership pending the investigation, which meant the fraudulent loan adjustments were frozen and all disputing borrowers were given the legal standing to contest their original terms. Walt Greer got his original interest rate reinstated retroactively. The Hennessy brothers had their water access challenge dismissed. The Callaway's boundary dispute was reviewed by a neutral surveyor and found to have been initiated on the basis of a falsified document from Langford's office. And Coulter Hayes paid off the original loan. The real loan, the amount he had actually agreed to, at the rate he had actually signed for in full from 3 seasons of cattle sales. That had been enough all along, had the interest not been artificially inflated to a figure designed to be unmanageable. The day he came home from the bank with the paid note in his hand, he stood in the kitchen doorway and held it up without saying anything, and Vivian looked at it, and then looked at him. And something that had been wound tight in both of them released at the same moment, and she laughed a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in so long it almost startled her. And he laughed too, that rusty gate laugh that had become less rusty over the weeks, and for a moment the kitchen was just sound and light, and the specific joy of a thing hard fought, finally finished. Then he crossed the room, and he took both her hands in his, and he looked at her and said, "It's done." "It's done," she said. "So I'm asking now," he said, "like I said I would." Her heart did something complicated. "All right," she said. He held her hands, and he looked at her with everything in his face that he had been keeping carefully managed for weeks. The hope, the care, the 9 years of alone that had been gradually, stubbornly, undeniably replaced by something else. And he said, "Stay. Not as the housekeeper. Not because the ranch needs someone. Because I need you. Because this house needs you in it the way it needs the fire in the stove and the light in the windows and the sound of someone else breathing in the dark." He paused. "I know that's not a poem. I'm not a poet. I know you're not," she said. "But I mean it." "I know you mean it," she said. "That's better than a poem." She was still holding his hands. Outside, the late afternoon was doing what Wyoming afternoons do in spring, going gold and wide and impossibly clear, the kind of light that makes everything look like it was made to last. "Yes," she said. He stared at her. "Yes, yes," she said again, and she was laughing again, and so was he. And outside the kitchen window, the valley that had been a battlefield for the better part of 3 months was just land again, good land, well-watered, worth every fight that had been fought for it, worth every step of those 8 miles. The yes changed everything, but it changed everything quietly. The way a season turns not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small moments that you only recognize as a turning when you look back at where you started. She did not move out of the housekeeper's room, not right away. They were not people who moved fast on the things that mattered, and they both understood instinctively that what had been built between them was strong precisely because it had been built slowly under pressure, with full knowledge of what it cost. You don't rush a foundation, you let it set. What changed was the quality of the dailiness. The way he said her name in the morning when she came down to the kitchen. Not the careful neutral tone of an employer, but something warmer, something that belonged to her. Specifically the way a word belongs to its meaning. The way she stopped editing herself at the supper table, stopped measuring what she said against what a housekeeper was supposed to say, and just talked to him the way she talked to him late at night over the lamp and the documents freely as herself. Pruitt's wife Eleanor came out to the ranch 2 weeks after the indictment. She came with a pie apple from dried fruit, the same kind Vivian had bought from Finch's forgotten stock that first trip to town. And she sat at the kitchen table and looked at Vivian with the direct eyes of a woman who has made a decision about someone and is simply confirming it in person. "I owe you an apology," Eleanor Pruitt said. Vivian looked up. "You don't. I do. Josiah watched and waited for 6 years, and I let him because I told myself it was safer. And the whole time Langford was doing what he was doing and 7 families lost their land, and I was baking pies and telling myself it wasn't my business." Her hands tightened around her coffee cup. "You walked 8 miles and fixed what 6 years of people like me not acting hadn't fixed. I owe you more than an apology, but it's what I've got right now." Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You sent your husband when it mattered. He came when I needed people to come. That's not nothing, Eleanor." Eleanor Pruitt looked at her for a long beat, and then she said with the directness of a woman who has decided to stop being careful about everything, "Is he going to ask you to marry him?" "He already did," Vivian said, "in his own way." "And I said yes," Vivian said, "in my own way." Eleanor Pruitt smiled. It transformed her face entirely, made her look 10 years younger and considerably less armored. "Good," she said. "This valley needs more women who say yes in their own way." The wedding was planned for late spring, when the ground had softened enough to make the road to the ranch passable for wagons, and when the worst of the legal proceedings were settled enough that Coulter could take 2 days away from the work without the work collapsing behind him. It was not a grand affair. Neither of them wanted grand. Grand was for people who needed witnesses to believe in what they were doing. What Coulter and Vivian had built needed no witnesses to make it real. The witnesses were a grace, not a necessity. But they came anyway, the witnesses. They came because in a valley that had spent 6 years shrinking under Langford's pressure, The Hayes wedding felt like something worth celebrating publicly. Pruitt and Eleanor came. Walt Greer came wearing the same coat he'd worn to his own wedding 40 years prior, which still fit, because Walt Greer, as he explained to anyone who would listen, had never had cause to change his shape. The Calloways came. The Hennessy brothers came. Daniel, wearing a clean shirt that was clearly borrowed, and Thomas still moving with the slightly bow-legged pride of a man who had ridden hard when it mattered and not been forgotten for it. Even some of the townspeople came, not Margaret Finch, but others, people who had watched what happened with Langford and recalculated their positions. People who understood that the woman they had whispered about was the woman who had read the documents that broke the man who had been squeezing them for years. Horace Finch came without his wife and shook Coulter's hand with the sheepish energy of a man trying to get ahead of his own guilt. Vivian stood at the front of the gathered people in her good dress, the blue one she had bought from the seamstress in Callow Creek 3 weeks before. Not the black of mourning and not the gray of getting by, but the real blue of a woman who has decided she is done dressing for other people's comfort, and she looked at Coulter Hayes standing across from her. This enormous, quiet, careful man who had opened a door for her 8 weeks before, with all the warmth of a man who had forgotten warmth was possible, and she thought about the road that had brought her here. $17. Worn-out boots. 8 miles on a dirt road in October. She had been looking for something worth fighting for. She had found it. She had found more than it. The minister said the words, and Coulter said his, and Vivian said hers. And when it was done, and he took her hands in his, the same gesture as that afternoon in the kitchen, but different now. Sealed, now permanent in the way that a thing freely chosen is permanent. She felt the particular stillness of a woman who has come to the end of a long journey and finds that the end is not an ending, but a beginning that simply looks different from where she stood at the start. "Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly, just for her. "Mr. Hayes," she said back, and smiled. The celebration went long into the afternoon, and Vivian moved through it with the ease of a woman in her own home, which is exactly what she was. And the ease was not performed, but real. She felt it in her body, in the way she laughed, without checking herself, in the way she held Eleanor Pruitt's arm, crossing the porch, and called out to the Hennessy brothers about the cobbler going fast, and told Walt Greer he was absolutely not leaving until he had eaten a proper supper, and the ranch that had been silent and tense, and carrying the weight of a decade of alone, rang with voices, and with the particular bright noise of people who have survived something difficult together and are now finally allowed to be glad. 3 months after the wedding, Vivian stood at the kitchen window in the early morning and understood before she had words for it that something had changed inside her own body. She stood very still for a long moment, hands on the windowsill, looking out at the yard where the new stable was going up. Coulter and Pruitt and the Hennessy brothers had been building it weekends through the spring, better than the old one, with proper ventilation and wider stalls, and a hay storage separate from the main structure, built by people who understood what had been lost and were determined to build something that wouldn't burn. She turned from the window when she heard him come in from the early check, and she looked at him across the kitchen, and whatever was in her face told him something immediately because he stopped in the doorway with that particular stillness of his. "What is it?" he said. She told him. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, and he held her face in both his hands, and he looked at her with an expression that she did not have words for then, and would not find words for later, only that it was the expression of a man receiving something he had given up, expecting something that goes past happiness, into the territory of restored, of returned, of made whole. "Are you sure?" he said. "I'm sure," she said. He pressed his forehead against hers, and they stood like that in the kitchen, in the early morning, the fire going in the stove, and the sounds of the new stable going up outside, and the whole of the valley around them settling into spring, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing that words could do, that the silence wasn't already doing better. The baby came in late autumn, a girl, and they named her Clara. Coulter had asked quietly, privately, whether Vivian would mind, and she had looked at him for a moment, and then said that she thought naming their daughter after a woman who had loved this land and this man, and had not gotten enough time, was exactly right. She said it without grief, and without competition, because she had learned that love is not a finite resource. and the love of a good man for a woman he has lost does not diminish the love of the same man for the woman who came after it. Only tells you what kind of man he is, what kind of love he's capable of, how deep the well goes. Clara Hayes arrived in the world with her father's dark eyes and her mother's absolute refusal to be quiet about anything, and the household, which had been organized and purposeful and good, became something more than all of that, became alive, in the particular way that a house with a new person in it becomes alive, chaotic, and exhausting, and irreversibly entirely worth it. Eleanor Pruitt came to help the first week. Walt Greer sent provisions. The Hennessy brothers sent a carved wooden horse that Thomas had made himself, which was rough-hewn and slightly lopsided, and genuinely one of the finest things Vivian had ever received. Daniel Hennessy, who had ridden hard to Cheyenne when it mattered, and not been thanked adequately in all the business that followed, stood in the doorway of the bedroom, with his hat in his hands, looking at the baby with the expression of a large man confronted with something small and important, and said, "She's real little. She'll get bigger," Vivian said. "Yeah," he said. "I reckon she will." By the following spring, the ranch had doubled its cattle operation with the cooperation of the Pruitt Ranch and a formal partnership agreement that Vivian had drafted and Arden had reviewed, and that gave both families a legal framework for shared water access and shared market arrangements that Langford's control of the valley had made impossible for years. 3 other families had joined a version of the cooperative by summer. It was not a large thing yet, but it was a real thing, and real things Vivian had come to understand are the only things that hold. There were still hard seasons. The winter of the following year was brutal, and they lost 11 head, and the creek froze in places it hadn't frozen in memory. And there were weeks where every day felt like a decision about whether to keep going or let the cold win. But they did not face those weeks alone, and that made the difference between difficulty and defeat. Pruitt rode over when the worst of it hit, and the Hennessy brothers came with extra feed when the South pasture supply ran short, and Vivian kept the house warm and the meals consistent and the accounts honest, and Coulter worked with the focused tenacity of a man who has more to fight for than he had before, and knows it. Clara learned to walk on the kitchen floor that Vivian had scrubbed on her hands and knees that first week, and she said her first word standing at the kitchen table, holding the edge with both fists, and that word, to no one's great surprise, and Coulter's particular delight, was not Mama or Dada, but a very firm and purposeful no directed at the ranch dog, who had been attempting to access the bread cooling on the table. "That's my daughter," Vivian said. "That's absolutely your daughter," Coulter agreed. There were mornings, spring mornings, when the light came in clean and cold through the kitchen windows and the valley lay out beyond the glass in all its wide and difficult beauty, when Vivian would stand at the stove with her coffee and think about the road. The 8 miles. The $17. The posted notice she had taken off the wall of the feed store because she needed to believe there was something at the end of it. She had been right to take it. She had been right to walk. Not because it had been easy. It had been the furthest thing from easy every step of it. Not because it had gone as planned. She had not had a plan, only a direction and a refusal to stop. But because she had understood somewhere on that road, with her boots giving out and the sky going dark, that the worst thing was not to try and fail. The worst thing was to stand still while the world made the decision for her. She had made her own decision. She had knocked on the door of a man who had forgotten what warmth felt like, and she had fixed his flu and cooked his food and read his documents and stood in his yard with smoke on her face and faced down a deputy who wanted her afraid, and she had sat at his table night after night and built something from paper and precision and pure stubborn refusal, and that something had been enough, more than enough. It had been everything. On a clear April morning, Coulter came in from the early check and found her at the window with Clara on her hip, both of them watching the sunrise over the eastern ridge, and he came to stand behind her and put his arm around them both, and the 3 of them stood like that while the light came up over the valley that was theirs, fully, legally, permanently, undeniably theirs. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. Clara said nothing. She was watching the light with the absolute focus of a person encountering something for the first time that they intend to remember. There are women who wait for the world to give them permission to take up space. Vivian Mercer had never been one of them. She had walked 8 miles in October with $17 and worn-out boots and knocked on a stranger's door and refused every invitation to be less than she was. And she had built a home in the hardest country in the territory with her hands and her mind and her unbreakable, unquiet, undefeatable heart. The ranch stood. The valley breathed. The woman who had been told she was too much had turned out to be exactly enough, and the life she had claimed miles